Are you even capable of being here, sailor? Or were you just sent to check a box on some diversity report? The words, sharp and dripping with condescension, cut through the dry, shimmering heat of the Nevada desert. The assembled group of Marines, soldiers, and airmen shifted on their feet, the nervous energy palpable under the oppressive sun. They laughed, a brittle, uncertain sound that died almost as soon as it was born, but it was enough. It was complicity. It was affirmation. Lieutenant Wallace, puffed up with the petty authority of a junior officer in charge of a multi-service training exercise, smirked. He had his audience. His target was a small, unassuming figure standing at ease in the back row, a woman whose fatigue seemed a size too large, her face impassive under the brim of her patrol cap. She didn't have the chiseled jaw of the Marine Force recon operators or the hulking frames of the Army Rangers. She was just there, an anomaly, an easy mark. When she didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the distant, heat-distorted mountains, Wallace's smirk tightened into a sneer. He strode towards her, his boots crunching on the gravel, a deliberate, theatrical sound designed to command attention. I asked you a question, petty officer. Or, is the Navy not teaching basic courtesies anymore? He stopped directly in front of her, invading her personal space, forcing the others to crane their necks to watch the unfolding humiliation. Still, she remained silent. Her posture didn't change. Her breathing didn't quicken. It was this silence, this profound and unnerving calm, that seemed to infuriate him the most. It was a denial of his power, a refusal to acknowledge the stage he had built. He saw it as disrespect, as insolence. He saw what his prejudice wanted him to see. He never saw the truth. He never saw the stillness of a predator waiting for the storm to pass. He only saw a target. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he snarled, and his hand came up. It wasn't a punch. It was something worse. It was a slap. A contemptuous, backhanded strike across the face, the crack of his palm against her cheek echoing with shocking clarity in the sudden, dead silence. Her head rocked back slightly with the impact, a single, involuntary motion. Then it returned to its original position, her eyes still fixed on that same point in the distance. She blinked once, slowly. That was all. There was no gasp of pain, no flinch, no tear welling in her eye. There was nothing, just a profound, absolute, and terrifying stillness. From a shaded observation deck 200 yards away, General Marcus Thorne lowered his high-power binoculars, a frown creasing his weathered face. He'd seen the whole exchange. He'd seen the lieutenant's strutting arrogance, the crowd's cowardly laughter, and the brutal, unprofessional strike. But it was the woman's reaction, or lack thereof, that held his attention. He raised the binoculars again, focusing tightly on her. He saw the faint red mark beginning to bloom on her cheek. He saw the utter lack of emotion in her expression. But he also saw something else. Something Wallace, in his blind arrogance, had missed entirely. He saw her stance. It wasn't the regulation at ease she was ostensibly holding. Her weight was perfectly centered, her feet just so. It was a shooter's stance, a fighter's stance, a stance of such disciplined neutrality that it was, in itself, a form of immense potential energy. It was the stance of someone who had spent thousands of hours turning their body into a weapon so finely tuned that stillness was its most dangerous state. The general felt a ghost of a memory, a flicker from a classified briefing years ago about a new breed of operator, one who blended in, who used anonymity as their primary camouflage. He couldn't place her, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him despite the desert heat, that Lieutenant Wallace had just made a mistake of catastrophic proportions. He had mistaken a lion for a lamb, and was about to learn the difference. If you believe that true strength is quiet and that competence is the only real authority, type respect in the comments below. The silence that followed the slap was a physical entity. It pressed in on the assembled soldiers, heavier than the desert sun. The nervous laughter was long dead, replaced by a collective, anxious intake of breath. They had expected a reaction, a cry of protest, a show of anger, a crumbling into tears, anything that would fit the narrative of a victim being justly, or unjustly put in their place. The absolute absence of one was deeply unsettling. It was like shouting into a void and getting not even an echo in return. Lieutenant Wallace, for his part, seemed to take her stillness as a victory, a confirmation of his initial judgment. His chest puffed out further. He had asserted his dominance, and she had, in his mind, folded. "See," he announced to the silent crowd, his voice a triumphant bark. "No fire. No fight. This is what I'm talking about. The standards are crumbling because we're prioritizing feelings over fierceness." He turned his back on her, a final act of dismissal. He walked back to the front of the formation, gesturing to a large schematic of the training facility, a sprawling, multi-building kill house complex designed to simulate a hostile embassy. "All right, listen up. The scenario is Operation Silent Alone, high-value hostage, multiple armed non-state actors. Intel is limited. Rules of engagement are strict. 0 collateral damage, 0 friendly fire. This is a test of precision, not just brute force." He began assigning roles, his voice crisp and authoritative again, the ugly incident already something he was moving past. He pointed to the burly Force Recon Marines. "Alpha Team, you're on primary breach. Dynamic entry through the front." He gestured to the Army Rangers. "Bravo, you'll be on overwatch and containment, securing the perimeter. Air Force, you run comms and drone surveillance." He went through the list, giving each unit a critical role in the complex, interlocking plan. Finally, he looked back over his shoulder, a dismissive flick of his eyes towards the woman he had just struck. He had forgotten her name, if he had ever bothered to learn it. "You," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Petty officer, whatever your name is. You're on rear security. Far rear. Find a spot 100 meters behind the main structure and secure it. Stay off the comms unless you're dying. Try not to get in the way." It was the ultimate insult, a role so meaningless it was effectively in order to be absent. In an operation predicated on precision and teamwork, he was making her a ghost, a non-entity. She simply gave a short, sharp nod. Understood. Her voice was clear, calm, and utterly devoid of inflection. It was the first time she had spoken. The single word, so neutral and professional, was more jarring to the assembled troops than a scream would have been. Up on the observation deck, General Thorne watched her walk away from the group without a backward glance. She moved with an economy of motion that was beautiful in its efficiency. No wasted steps, no hesitation. She found her designated spot behind a low berm of sand and rock, a position with a clear view of the back of the kill house, but far removed from the action. She knelt, not in the dirt, but in a fluid motion that brought her down to one knee. She unslung her rifle, an M4 carbine, standard issue. But as Thorne watched through his powerful optics, he noticed the subtle, non-regulation modifications. The custom grip, the aftermarket trigger group, the unique wear patterns on the receiver, indicative of tens of thousands of rounds fired. He then saw her check her sidearm, a Sig Sauer P226, standard for her service branch. But she didn't just check it. She performed a press check with a practiced fluidity that was less a military drill and more musician's warm-up. And on her wrist, partially obscured by her cuff, was a Garmin Tactics watch, a high-end GPS timepiece favored by a very specific and very small community within the special operations world. Each detail was a quiet breadcrumb. Each piece of gear was a silent testament. The general felt the flicker of recognition grow stronger. He had seen that quiet professionalism before, in places he couldn't speak of, in men and women whose names were erased from public record. He looked at the oblivious lieutenant, barking orders and psyching up his breach team, and then back at the lone, still woman 100 meters away. The exercise, he knew, was about to begin, but the real test had already started. The command came crackling over the radio. "Initiate, initiate, initiate." The air exploded with choreographed violence. Alpha Team, the Force Recon Marines, stacked up on the main entrance of the kill house. With a deafening boom from a breaching charge, the heavy steel door blew inwards, and they poured through the smoke-filled opening, muzzle flashes strobing in the manufactured gloom. Their movements were aggressive, loud, and by the book. Shouts of "clear" and "moving" echoed from within, punctuated by the sharp reports of simulation rounds. On the perimeter, Bravo teams, Rangers fanned out, their rifles scanning the windows and rooftops, a textbook cordon. From the sky, the quiet hum of a surveillance drone provided a bird's-eye view to the Air Force controllers in the command tent. It was, for the first few moments, a perfect execution of modern combined arms doctrine. It was sound and fury, signifying competence. But inside the embassy, the script began to deviate. The OPFOR, the opposing force playing the role of the terrorists, were not the usual reservists. They were seasoned instructors from the base's own advanced tactics school, and they had designed the problem from hell. The Marines of Alpha Team, expecting a linear series of rooms to clear, ran into a nightmare of interlocking, diagonal firing lanes. The interior architecture had been reconfigured overnight. Walls were missing where they should have been, and new ones had been erected to create deadly funnels. A tripwire, cleverly hidden along a baseboard, triggered a series of flashbangs that disoriented the lead element. Contact front. Contact left. The comms, once clear and confident, became a chaotic jumble of panicked shouts. Lieutenant Wallace, positioned with the command element just outside the breach point, felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The plan was falling apart. Alpha 1, report. What's your status? He yelled into his handset. The reply was garbled. Bogged down multiple angles, can't advance. The simulation rounds, which fired a painful but non-lethal paintball-like projectile, were taking their toll. Red and blue splatters began appearing on the body armor of the lead Marines. One by one, their personal alert sensors chirped, signaling they were killed and out of the fight. The dynamic breach had devolved into a static firefight. On the command deck, General Thorne watched the drone feed on a large monitor, his expression grim. He could see the tactical breakdown in real time. Wallace's plan had been arrogant. It had assumed a compliant, predictable enemy. It had relied on overwhelming force, but it lacked cunning. It lacked finesse. They're being channeled, Thorne muttered to his aide. The OPFOR is bleeding them dry, forcing them into a single kill zone. His gaze shifted from the chaotic drone feed to the small monitor showing a fixed camera view of the rear of the complex. There, in the corner of the screen, was Petty Officer Sharma. She hadn't moved. She was still in the exact same kneeling position, her rifle held at a low ready. She was a statue of patience. To Wallace, she was a non-factor, a piece of dead weight he had cast aside. To the general, she was now the most interesting person on the entire battlefield. He watched her, wondering what she was seeing, what she was processing. The chaos on the comms was a symphony of failure. The precision he had demanded was nowhere to be found. And in the heart of that failure, the silence of the woman he had humiliated began to feel less like weakness and more like the calm at the center of a gathering storm. The exercise reached its nadir with a single, chilling transmission from the command tent's controllers. Catastrophic failure imminent. We have a trigger on the hostage vest. I repeat, the hostage vest is live. 30 seconds to simulated detonation. A collective groan went through the observation deck. In the rigid rules of the simulation, a detonated hostage vest was an instant and total failure for the assault force. It meant the mission was over. The team had lost. Over the radio, Lieutenant Wallace's voice was a raw scream of pure frustration. Alpha pushed through. Damn it, push. But there was nowhere to push. They were pinned, trapped in a fatal funnel of their own making. The exercise was lost. The humiliation was complete. And then, something impossible happened. On the monitor, showing the rear of the building, the statue moved. Petty Officer Sharma rose from her kneeling position, not with a scramble, but with a single, silent unfolding, like a blade opening. There was no hesitation, no radio call for permission. She simply acted. The narration of her movement would not be one of thoughts or feelings, but of pure, kinetic poetry. She did not run towards the building. She flowed. Her feet barely seemed to touch the gravel, her body low and compact. She carried her rifle in one hand, held against her chest in a high-port position that allowed for maximum speed without sacrificing readiness. She reached the rear wall of the kill house, a sheer 10-foot face of concrete block. She did not look for a door. Doors were for people who follow the rules. Doors were for the predictable. She leaped, her hand finding a hold on a protruding pipe. Her feet found purchase on a window ledge. In a display of strength and agility that seemed to defy gravity, she scaled the wall, her movements economical and utterly silent. There was no grunt of effort, no scrape of gear against concrete. One moment she was on the ground, the next she was slipping through a second-story window like smoke. Silence was her creed. Silence was the canvas on which she painted her art. Silence was the promise she had made to the fallen men whose names were carved on a granite wall in Virginia Beach. Inside, the world was a cacophony of simulated gunfire and shouting. But she moved through it untouched, a ghost in the machine. The Opfer, focused entirely on the pinned-down Marines at the front, never saw her. She moved along the upper floor, her steps perfectly timed to the rhythm of the chaos below. An Opfer guard, posted at the top of a stairwell, turned as some sixth sense prickled the back of his neck. He saw nothing but a flicker of shadow. A hand came out of the darkness, not in a strike, but in a precise, fluid motion that tapped the sensor on his chest, killing him instantly. He stood there, stunned into silence, a red light blinking on his vest. She was already gone. She descended the stairs, a phantom in the hallways. She neutralized two more hostiles with the same silent, terrifying efficiency, tapping their sensors before they could even raise their weapons. She reached the central chamber where the hostage was being held. The final Opfer member had his weapon trained on the door, expecting the Marines to finally break through. The simulated bomb vest on the hostage, a mannequin, had a large digital timer on it. 0:07, 0:06. She entered the room from a side door he had deemed secure. He never heard it open. With 5 seconds left, he finally sensed her presence and began to turn. Too late. A tap on his back sensor. He was out, but the timer was still counting. 0:03, 0:02. Disarming it was impossible in the time remaining. But she wasn't trying to disarm it. Her objective was the hostage, not the bomb. In a blur of motion, she used a combat knife to slash the zip ties binding the mannequin to a chair. With one arm, she hauled the 150-pound dummy off the chair and, with a powerful shove, threw it into a reinforced steel locker built into the wall of the room. She slammed the heavy door shut just as the timer on the vest hit midnight. A loud beep echoed through the room, signaling the simulated detonation. But the hostage was secure. By the strictest letter of the exercise law, she had saved the high-value asset. She had won an unwinnable scenario. The kill house, which seconds before had been a storm of noise, fell into a profound and absolute silence. The silence that descended upon the training complex was heavier and more complete than the one that had followed the slap. It was a silence born not of tension, but of sheer, unadulterated shock. On the observation deck, the assembled officers and NCOs stared at the monitors, their mouths agape. In the command tent, the exercise controllers looked at each other, then back at their screens, trying to process the data. "Run that back," one of them whispered. "Confirm hostage status." The reply came a moment later, clinical and laced with disbelief. "Hostage is secure. Asset is viable. Blue Force wins." The words seemed to hang in the air, nonsensical. It was like watching a chess game where a player, checkmated and defeated, suddenly revealed a hidden piece that swept the board. Inside the kill house, the Marines of Alpha Team, still huddled in their fatal funnel, heard the silence and assumed the worst. Then the voice of the lead controller came over their squad net. "Exercise complete. All Opfer units neutralized. Hostage secured. I say again, hostage is secured." They looked at each other in bewilderment. It made no sense. They hadn't moved. They hadn't fired a shot in the last minute. The Opfer role players, rising from where they had been killed, were just as confused. The veteran instructor who had been tapped on the stairwell was shaking his head, trying to explain to his teammates what he hadn't seen. It was like a whisper, a shadow. "I didn't hear a thing." Lieutenant Wallace stood frozen outside the breach point, the radio handset still pressed to his ear. His mind was a maelstrom of denial. "That's impossible," he muttered, the words catching in his throat. "That's not possible. My team was pinned. How?" He stumbled into the kill house, his feet crunching on the spent simulation casings. He saw his remaining men, looking dazed. He saw the OPFOR instructors gathering together and speaking in low, astonished tones. He walked through the reconfigured hallways until he reached the central chamber. He saw the last OPFOR guard standing next to the open locker, pointing at the mannequin inside. And he saw her. Petty Officer Sharma was walking calmly out of the chamber, her rifle now slung across her back. Her breathing was even. Her expression was the same impassive mask it had been all day. There was no sign of exertion, no sheen of sweat on her brow. She looked as if she had just been for a quiet walk. She brushed past him without a word, heading for the exit. He watched her go, his arrogance shattering like glass, replaced by a cold, terrifying wave of cognitive dissonance. The woman he had dismissed, humiliated, and physically struck had just single-handedly accomplished what his entire hand-picked team of elite warriors could not. She hadn't just completed the mission, she had redefined it. She had broken the game and reassembled it according to her own rules. As she stepped out into the blinding sunlight, she saw a figure walking directly toward her. It was General Thorne. He had descended from the observation tower, his face a granite mask of purpose. He walked past the confused Marines, past the stunned OPFOR, past a pale and trembling Lieutenant Wallace. He did not acknowledge any of them. His eyes were fixed on one person and one person only. The entire training area seemed to hold its breath. Every eye was on the 4-star general and the unassuming petty officer. He stopped a respectful 10 feet from her. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, his gaze intense and searching, as if trying to reconcile the quiet woman before him with the ghost he had just witnessed on the monitors. For a long moment, the only sound was the desert wind. General Thorne held his gaze on Petty Officer Sharma for a full 10 seconds. In that silence, a universe of questions was asked and answered. He saw the faint red mark still visible on her cheek, a stark emblem of the morning's disgrace. He saw the absolute lack of vindication in her eyes. There was no "I told you so," no flicker of triumph. There was only the calm, steady professionalism of someone for whom excellence was not an event, but a state of being. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice a low rumble that carried with absolute authority across the now-crowded plaza. "Petty officer," he stated, his tone layered with a meaning that went far beyond her apparent rank. He then turned his head slightly, his eyes finding his aide who was scrambling to keep up. "Captain, give me her service record." Now the captain, wide-eyed, fumbled with his encrypted data pad, his fingers flying across the screen. Lieutenant Wallace, who had followed Sharma out of the kill house, stood rooted to the spot, a spectator at his own execution. A nauseating sense of dread, cold and heavy, was pooling in his gut. The captain approached the general and handed him the data pad, his hand trembling slightly. General Thorne took it without looking away from Sharma. He held the tablet in one hand, his thumb scrolling down the screen. The assembled crowd of soldiers, Marines, and airmen watched, their confusion slowly morphing into a dawning, fearful understanding. Something monumental was happening. The general's eyes scanned the digital file. The narrator's voice could have been reading from the screen itself, each word a hammer blow against the foundation of Wallace's world. Name, Anya Sharma. Rank, Petty Officer Second Class. A pause. The general's thumb scrolled further. Unit, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the crowd. Not just the Navy, not just the SEALs. Development Group, DevGru, the common, unclassified designation for the unit popularly known as SEAL Team 6. The tip of the spear's tip, a name spoken only in hushed, reverent tones. The general continued scrolling, his voice flat and steady, letting the weight of the facts do the work. Call sign, Nyx. The name settled over the crowd. Nyx, the Greek goddess of the night, a name that spoke of shadow and silence. Combat déploiement, 12. Locations, classified. Mission details, classified. The word classified was a wall, hinting at a world of violence and valor that none of them could possibly imagine. Specialty qualifications, Master Breacher. Advanced Field Medicine. Covert methods of entry. Lead Instructor, Tier 1, Close Quarters Battle. The list went on, a litany of impossible skills, a curriculum from a school of myths. Awards and commendations, the general's voice hardened. The Navy Cross Shock, the nation's second highest award for valor in combat. The Silver Star, with one oak leaf cluster more shock. The Bronze Star with V device for valor, for oak leaf clusters. It was a record that belonged not to a person, but to a legend. The general looked up from the screen, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He looked directly at Lieutenant Wallace, a look of such profound disappointment and contempt that Wallace physically flinched, as if from another blow. Then, the general turned his full attention back to Petty Officer Anya Sharma. He squared his shoulders, his posture becoming ramrod straight, an emotion that was slow, deliberate, and imbued with all the weight of his 4 stars and 40 years of service. He brought his hand up to his brow in a crisp, perfect salute. It was not the casual salute one gives a junior. It was the salute of a soldier to a hero. It was a gesture of profound, unconditional respect. The silence was absolute. And then he spoke, his voice thick with an emotion that was part censure, part apology, part reverence. "Ma'am," he said. The word hung in the air, a thunderclap of vindication. He did not call her petty officer. He did not call her Sharma. He called her ma'am, the highest form of address, a recognition of her true stature that transcended the rank on her collar. On behalf of the United States Armed Forces, I apologize for the conditions of this training environment. I assure you, it will be rectified immediately. The story of what happened that day in the Nevada desert did not just spread, it detonated. It moved at the speed of gossip and the velocity of myth. By sunset, every soldier on the base knew. They knew about the arrogant lieutenant and the public slap. They knew about the impossible simulation and the ghost who had walked through walls. They knew about the 4-star general and the salute that had shaken an entire command structure. The tale was told in hushed tones in the barracks, in animated retellings in the chow hall, and through encrypted text messages that flew between bases across the country. It was dubbed the Ballad of Nix and the Lieutenant, or more simply, the day the general said ma'am. The details, as they always do, began to warp and magnify with each telling. In some versions, Petty Officer Sharma had neutralized 30 OPFOR members, not just a handful. In others, she had disarmed the bomb with a paperclip while blindfolded. But the core of the story, the essential truth of it, remained intact and potent. It was a story about assumptions. It was a story about the vast, dangerous gulf between appearance and reality. It became a cautionary tale, a brutal lesson whispered to new arrivals. Watch your mouth, because you never know who you're talking to. The quiet logistics specialist might have a Delta Force tab under his collar. The unassuming admin clerk might have a signals intelligence background that would make your head spin. And the quiet, small-statured petty officer you're about to dismiss might be a living legend who dines on chaos for breakfast. Lieutenant Wallace became the face of that lesson. He was formally relieved of his duties, pending a full Article 15 hearing for conduct unbecoming an officer in assault. He was confined to his quarters, stripped of his authority, a pariah on the base he had so arrogantly commanded only that morning. The narrative of his downfall was swift and merciless. He wasn't just a failed officer, he was a fool. A man who had held a priceless diamond in his hand and, believing it to be a common stone, had thrown it against a wall, only to watch it cut through the concrete. We see him in a sterile, featureless room, staring at the blank wall. He isn't angry. The arrogance has been scoured out of him, burned away by the acid of his public humiliation. What remains is a profound and hollow shame. He replays the moment of the slap over and over in his mind. He had seen her silence as weakness, her small stature as inadequacy. He had judged the book by its cover, And the book turned out to be a classified operational manual written in a language he couldn't even begin to comprehend. His mistake wasn't just tactical or professional. It was a fundamental failure of character. He had failed the first and most important test of leadership, to see the humanity and potential in those under his command, regardless of the package it came in. He had sought to make an example of her, and in the end, the universe had made an example of him. The irony was so perfect, so crushing, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. And for the first time in his privileged life, Lieutenant Wallace understood what it truly felt like to be small. Days turned into a week. The official investigation into Lieutenant Wallace proceeded with clinical efficiency, but the real judgment had already been rendered in the court of public opinion on the base. For Wallace, the process was a slow, grinding humiliation. He was interviewed by grim-faced officers from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, his every word recorded, his every excuse dismantled. He knew his career was over. The stain of striking an enlisted service member, let alone one whose file read like a piece of modern mythology, was indelible. But somewhere in the quiet solitude of his confinement, a change began to occur. The brittle shell of his pride had been shattered, and what lay beneath was something raw and teachable. He finally requested a formal meeting, not with his commanding officer or a lawyer, but with Petty Officer Anya Sharma. The request was so unusual, it went all the way up to General Thorne's office. Permission was granted. Wallace was escorted by 2 military policemen to a small, nondescript briefing room. Sharma was already there, sitting at a simple table, a bottle of water in front of her. She wore the same plain fatigues, her expression as neutral as ever. She looked up as he entered. Wallace stood before her, the MPs waiting by the door. He was no longer the strutting, arrogant officer. His uniform was immaculate, but his shoulders were slumped. He couldn't meet her eyes. He stared at a point on the wall, just over her head. Petty Officer Sharma, he began, his voice hoarse, stripped of its former bluster. They made me come here to offer a formal apology as part of my corrective action. He paused, swallowing hard. But that's not why I asked to see you. He finally forced himself to look at her. I'm not here to apologize for my career. It's over and I deserve it. I'm here to apologize for what I did. To you. The disrespect was inexcusable. I was arrogant. I was ignorant. I saw what I wanted to see, not what was there. His voice cracked. I failed the most basic test of an officer. I failed to see the person. I have no excuse, ma'am. None. He used the word ma'am deliberately, quietly, not with the general's booming authority, but with the simple, painful weight of earned humility. Sharma listened, her head tilted slightly. She let the silence hang in the room for a long moment after he finished. She studied his face, seeing not the bully from the training ground, but a broken man trying to piece himself back together. Her response, when it came, was the epitome of her character. She offered no absolution, no comforting words, no discussion of forgiveness. She simply gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. Understood, she said. The word was not a pardon. It was not an acceptance. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition that his apology had been received. It was a closing of the loop, a final, quiet act of professionalism. For Wallace, it was everything. He nodded back, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He turned and walked out of the room without another word. Meanwhile, the legend of her actions continued to build its own legacy. The OPFOR instructors, all seasoned combat veterans themselves, had informally renamed the second-story window she had used to enter the kill house. They called it Nix's Gate. The name stuck. It became an unofficial landmark on the base. New trainees on the kill house course would be brought to the back of the building, and an instructor would point up at the window. See that, they'd say. That's Nix's Gate. Let me tell you a story about why you should never, ever judge a book by its cover. Sharma, for her part, deflected all attention. She declined interviews, avoided the mess hall during peak hours, and kept to herself. But she was not idle. A few days after the incident, she was seen on the base's main obstacle course. A young female Marine, barely out of boot camp, was struggling with the high wall, tears of frustration in her eyes as a group of her male peers snickered from a distance. Sharma walked over, not with the air of a legendary operator, but of a patient teacher. "You're trying to pull yourself up," Sharma said, her voice quiet and direct. "Don't pull. Drive. Use your legs. Your center of gravity is lower. That's a strength, not a weakness. Pop your hips. Like this," and she demonstrated, flowing over the wall in a single, fluid motion. She then spent the next hour coaching the young Marine, her instructions precise, technical, and encouraging, until the young woman was clearing the wall with newfound confidence. That was her way. She didn't give speeches about respect. She demonstrated it. She didn't lecture on competence. She taught it. 6 months passed. The blistering heat of summer gave way to the cool, crisp air of a desert winter. The incident involving Lieutenant Wallace and Petty Officer Sharma was no longer a piece of fresh gossip. It had hardened into institutional folklore. The culture at the training center had undergone a subtle but significant shift. The story of Nix's Gate was now formally incorporated into the introductory brief for all personnel newly assigned to the base. It was told not as a story of revenge, but as a mandatory lesson in professional humility and the critical importance of looking past superficial biases. The base commander himself would deliver it, ending with the same line every time: "Your assumptions are your biggest enemy. They'll get you killed faster than any bullet. Here, we value competence." Period. The ripple effects of that day continued to spread. Lieutenant Wallace, as expected, was found guilty of all charges. The review board, having read Sharma's full, classified service record, had shown no mercy. He was given a general discharge under honorable conditions, a career-ending judgment that effectively banished him from the world he had known. But the man who left the service was not the same one who had entered that hearing. The narrative shows him months later, working a civilian logistics job at a shipping port. He's thinner, quieter. His once arrogant swagger is gone, replaced by a watchful stillness. He is seen during a tense union dispute on the loading docks, where a loudmouth foreman is berating a young female worker. The old Wallace would have sided with authority or simply ignored it. The new Wallace steps in. He doesn't raise his voice. He simply stands beside the young woman and speaks to the foreman in a low, calm tone, de-escalating the situation by listening, by asking questions, by treating the worker with a dignity her boss had denied her. He had learned the lesson. He had learned that true strength wasn't about shouting others down. It was about lifting others up. He had learned it in the most public and painful way imaginable, but he had learned it. Petty Officer Anya Sharma was no longer at the base. Her quiet tour as an evaluator had ended. She had disappeared back into the classified world from which she had emerged, her name once again becoming a whisper, a call sign on a mission roster somewhere dark and dangerous. But her legacy remained, not just in the story, but in the people she had affected. The young Marine she had coached on the obstacle course had gone on to break the course record for female recruits, her confidence soaring. She now mentored other young women, teaching them the same lessons about using their unique strengths. The narrator's voice swells, articulating the core theme of the entire saga. True strength is not loud. It does not need to announce itself. It is the quiet, unwavering confidence that comes from preparation, discipline, and a profound self-awareness. True respect is not demanded. It is earned. It is the natural consequence of demonstrated competence. The world is full of noise, of people shouting to be heard, desperate for validation. But the ones who truly change the world are the quiet professionals, the ones who focus on the work, not the credit. They're the calm minds in the center of the storm, the steady hands that guide the ship through the roughest seas. They don't need to tell you who they are. Their actions are their biography. Their competence is their creed. Their legacy is not the noise they make, but the silence of a job perfectly done. Years later, the desert sun beat down on a different kind of ceremony. General Marcus Thorne, now with silver hair and a few more lines etched around his eyes, stood at a podium delivering his retirement speech. He had served for over 40 years, a witness to history from the Cold War to the complexities of the 21st century. The audience, a mix of high-ranking officials, lifelong colleagues, and young service members, expected a speech full of grand geopolitical insights and nostalgic war stories. The general gave them something else. In a long career, he began, his voice steady and clear, you collect a lot of memories. You see moments of incredible bravery, moments of profound sacrifice. But the moments that define you, the ones that teach you the most important lessons, are often the quietest. He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the crowd. I'm not going to talk about battles or campaigns today. I'm going to tell you one story. A story about a hot day in Nevada, a failed training exercise, and a petty officer second class named Anya Sharma. A murmur went through the older members of the audience. They remembered. The younger ones listened intently, sensing this was not just an anecdote. He recounted the events of that day with stark simplicity. He spoke of the lieutenant's casual cruelty, born of ignorance. He described the impossible feat of skill that had left everyone speechless. He lingered on the moment he read her file, the litany of valor and classified service. But he told the story not to glorify a super soldier. He told it as the embodiment of an ideal. Petty Officer Sharma, call sign Nix, was a hero of the highest order, the general said, his voice resonating with deep conviction. But her heroism that day wasn't just in her actions in the kill house. Her true heroism was in her silence. It was in the dignity she maintained in the face of public humiliation. It was in the unwavering discipline that refused to be provoked. She possessed an internal fortress of character that no insult could breach. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with the young men and women in the front rows. She taught me, a four-star general, a lesson I carry with me to this day. That true worth is proven through action, not assertion. That respect is a currency earned only through demonstrated excellence. She reminded me that the most dangerous person on any battlefield is the one you underestimate, the quiet professional. He then revealed what had happened after. The incident had triggered a high-level review of training and evaluation protocols across all branches. Because of what happened that day, he explained, a new program was created, a program designed to actively identify and cultivate unconventional talent, to look past the surface and find the hidden gems we were so often overlooking. The officer chosen to design and lead that program, to write its curriculum from the ground up, was Anya Sharma. Her legacy isn't a single act of bravery in a simulated battle. Her legacy is a systemic change that ensures thousands of others like her will be seen for the content of their character and the quality of their competence, not dismissed because they don't fit a preconceived mold. The final philosophical paragraph arrives, a summation of the enduring moral. The story of Anya Sharma became more than a legend. It became a doctrine, a reminder that a uniform signifies service, but it does not define the warrior within. Legacy isn't a statue or a plaque. It's the continuation of an idea. It's the standard that is upheld long after you're gone. It is the quiet competence that echoes in the actions of those you inspire. It is the respect that is paid forward from one generation of quiet professionals to the next, ensuring that the silence of true strength will always, in the end, be heard louder than the noise of arrogance. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud prejudice, and where character, not conformity, defines a warrior's worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.